My brother generously invited us to stay at his home without charging us rent or utilities. As someone who manages finances for a living, I was grateful for the arrangement. My husband, Stephen, is a mechanic, and we live in the house where I grew up, a property that holds deep sentimental value in my family's history. This house was once the headquarters for my father's business, which my brother was expected to inherit. He pursued a degree in economics, furthering his studies at Oxford University, and after gaining valuable knowledge, he returned to New York to join our father in running the business. When our parents decided to retire and relocate, they handed the business over to my brother and gifted me the house. Stephen and I decided to make it our home, conveniently located near public transportation, shops, hospitals, and schools. The house suits our needs perfectly and will continue to do so even after our children leave. We felt profoundly grateful to our parents for this gift and looked forward to building our future in this home. However, our peace was soon disrupted by frequent visits from my mother-in-law. She often asked about my parents' finances, given their history as business owners. Questions like, "Angela, how much money do your parents have, and what will you inherit when they pass?" made me uncomfortable. I attempted to deflect her curiosity by saying I hadn't given it much thought and that the house might be the extent of any inheritance. Yet she persisted, insinuating that my parents must have discussed their financial plans with me. Her interest seemed rooted in the expectation of gaining something from their wealth, even though I had been clear about what I would inherit. This situation created unexpected tension and made me uneasy about her motives. I chose not to share my concerns with Stephen, who was particularly close to his mother, hoping to avoid further complications. Then, an utterly unexpected event unfolded that took me by surprise. It was a holiday morning, around 7:00 a.m., when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Upon opening the door, I was greeted by a mover, leaving me both shocked and confused. Before I could gather my thoughts, my mother-in-law, along with my brother-in-law's family, arrived announcing that they were moving in. The smirks on their faces sent a chill through me. My husband, awakening to the commotion, seemed unfazed by the situation. When I confronted him about the situation, he simply asked, "What's the problem?" He pointed out that our house had plenty of space for everyone, as if it were perfectly normal for them to just move in. The surprises kept coming when my sister-in-law cheerfully declared that they had been invited by my brother. She explained that they wouldn't need to pay rent or utilities and were looking forward to our hospitality. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law began intrusively inspecting the rooms, deciding aloud which he preferred based on the sunlight and instructing Stephen to clear out our belongings. As this surreal scenario unfolded, I felt a sense of vertigo from the shock. This was our home, yet they were behaving as if they owned the place, opening doors and claiming rooms. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had already been quite overbearing, with my sister-in-law rummaging through my bag without permission on previous occasions. Their audacious behavior continued to encroach on my personal space, and my patience was wearing thin. This was the last straw. Frustrated and determined, I finally stood my ground. "This is my house," I declared. "Why are you acting like you own it? I've had enough. I want everyone to leave." The time had come to reclaim my space and restore peace to our home. Typically, I am composed and not one to raise my voice, but watching them take over the house my parents had entrusted to me pushed me to my limits. That's why I lost my temper and shouted at all three of them. However, the situation escalated unexpectedly when one of them retorted, "How dare you talk to us like that? You're the one who should leave." Shortly after, I felt a sharp sting on my cheek and realized, with disbelief, that I had been slapped. The pain throbbed painfully, and in that instant, something inside me broke. Living with people capable of such disrespect was unthinkable. But this house was mine, and I wouldn't allow them to treat it like a free hostel. So, I made the difficult decision to leave, if only temporarily. I quickly packed some essentials and found a monthly rental apartment to stay in for the time being. This meant I would have to commute to work, but it felt like the only viable option at that moment. Once settled, I called my parents to explain the ordeal. Even through the phone, I could sense their outrage. My father, who has always balanced his roles as a strict CEO and a loving father brilliantly, was particularly upset. I hated bringing them into this mess, especially as they were finally enjoying their retirement, but I had no choice. My rightful home was being encroached upon. While I adjusted to life in the rental apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that my husband and his family were getting too comfortable in my house. Motivated by suggestions from my brother and father, I decided it was time to take further action. A few days later, during a break at work, I checked my phone and saw dozens of missed calls and messages from my husband. I knew exactly why he was trying to reach me. It was time to address the situation head-on. But this time, I would be prepared and not alone in my fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine. In response to the untenable situation at home, I took a firm step and contacted the utility companies to disconnect the electricity and water services to the house. Our home was entirely dependent on electricity. Without it, nothing would function. We hadn't installed solar panels yet, so there was no alternative power source. Given the current heat wave, I imagined living without these basic amenities would be quite difficult. This action likely prompted the flurry of calls from my husband, who was probably trying to manage the sudden lack of utilities. Just as I was about to dismiss another call from him, my phone rang again during my break. "Hey, what's going on? There's no power and the water isn't running. Did you cut off the electricity and water?" His voice was tinged with panic. I explained that since the house was mine and I was no longer living there, it didn't make sense to keep paying for utilities I wasn't using. "The house belongs to me," I said firmly. "Now that I'm not there, it wouldn't be sensible to keep the electricity and water running. Keeping these services active would mean I'd have to cover the bills, which doesn't seem fair under the circumstances." When I shared my reasoning, my husband became very upset and demanded that I turn the services back on immediately. However, just because he wanted them reinstated didn't mean I was obliged to comply. I told him that if they wanted the utilities back, they should pay for them themselves. Every time we discussed finances, they insisted that since it was my house, I should bear the costs, but their actions suggested otherwise. I had no intention of renewing the utility contracts or asking them to vacate the house. After making my stance clear, I ended the call as my break was coming to an end. Later, my mother-in-law, sister-in-law, and brother-in-law all reached out with similar requests, complaining about the unbearable heat and the inconvenience caused by the lack of water. They wanted me to reconnect the utilities, but my decision was firm. This was a matter of principle and a step toward asserting my boundaries within my own property. After hearing their complaints, I firmly told them to handle the situation themselves and hung up the phone. I suspected they were just being opportunistic, hoping I would cave so they could continue living comfortably at my expense. However, even after a week, there was no sign of them leaving. Realizing I needed to take more decisive action, I consulted a lawyer from my father's company. I explained the situation and requested that he send a formal notice to my husband, accusing them of trespassing. They had entered and occupied my house without permission, essentially forcing me out and treating it as their own. In the notice, I made it clear that I was seriously considering legal action. This move shocked my husband. Surprised and anxious about the legal implications, he approached me, hoping to find a resolution. I was aware of their concern for their social reputation, and it felt like a turning point in our struggle for control of my home. I knew that the threat of a lawsuit would weigh heavily on them. Despite their desire to maintain their lifestyle, they were caught in a dilemma: face legal consequences or convince me to let them stay. I could see through my husband's intentions, but I refused to listen to their pleas or relent to his requests. In a moment of frustration, my husband exploded in anger during a call at work, demanding that I drop the lawyer and accusing me of acting self-righteous. Despite his loud outbursts, I remained calm and unfazed, merely annoyed by his audacity to claim rights over my property. No matter how much he protested, my stance was firm. If they continued to squat in my house, legal action was inevitable. I ended the call, feeling that further engagement would be pointless. I had already discussed potential divorce proceedings with my lawyer. Later, when I returned home, I found missed calls from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Choosing not to engage any further, I blocked their numbers to avoid more disruptions. The looming threat of legal action proved too much for my husband's prideful family. Realizing their position was indefensible, they packed their bags and left the house. With the assistance of my lawyer, the divorce negotiations proceeded smoothly. I arranged for a professional cleaning service to refresh the home, and after living separately in a monthly rental, nothing compared to the comfort of returning to my own now sparkling clean space. The peace and autonomy I felt were truly liberating. I felt a sense of triumph, reaffirming that my decision to stand up for my rights and reclaim my space was worth it. After moving back into my house, I recognized that it needed some updates and repairs. I discussed this with my father, who connected me with a reliable contractor, and we began planning the renovations. It was an exciting project that marked a fresh start in my comfortably solitary life. Living alone brought a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and soothing. I could relax on my sofa without judgment, eat whatever I fancied without comments, and simply enjoy the peace. However, this tranquility was disrupted 5 months into my newfound solitude when I started receiving calls from an unknown number. Initially, I assumed it was the contractor and ignored the calls, but they kept coming. Eventually, I answered, only to find it was my ex-husband, the very person I had recently divorced under strict legal agreements that prohibited us from contacting each other. Confused and irritated by his breach of our agreement, especially since he had changed his number to call me, I demanded to know why he was reaching out. Ignoring my questions, he pleaded with me to listen. Despite my reluctance, he explained his situation. His company was facing a severe financial crisis, resulting in a significant salary cut. Additionally, his mother's health was deteriorating, preventing her from working, and his sister-in-law and her husband were also in financial trouble due to unstable employment, with most of her earnings going toward her husband's debts. As a result, my ex-husband and his family were struggling to make ends meet. Hearing this did little to stir my empathy. The memories of how they had forcibly barged into my home, assumed control without my permission, and even tried to push me out were still fresh. Their previous disregard and disrespect made it difficult for me to feel anything but disbelief at their current plight. I told him that his difficulties were his to manage and reminded him of our legal agreement to cease contact. As I ended the call, I couldn't shake the incredulity that people who had treated me so poorly expected sympathy or help from me now. I listened, devoid of compassion, as my ex-husband described their dire circumstances. We're in serious trouble. We might not be able to pay our rent or even buy food tomorrow. We used to be a family, right? Please help us, he pleaded, his voice breaking with emotion. Yet his words did nothing to sway my resolve. I vividly recalled my struggles and how, when I needed support, my ex-husband did nothing to help. He, along with my mother-in-law, had always looked down on me. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law joined in as well, mocking my appearance and traditional views without a shred of concern for my feelings. My mother-in-law not only escalated situations but relentlessly pressured me to have a child, pushing herbal concoctions on me, booking unnecessary medical appointments, and even spreading damaging rumors among our neighbors about my ability to conceive. Reflecting on these memories, it became clear that there wasn't a single redeeming moment in my marriage. The man who had once been kind and supportive transformed into a mere puppet under his mother's influence after we wed. I remembered a particularly vivid incident when, after returning from an appointment, I learned that my mother-in-law had visited our home, crying to my husband about wanting to befriend me while simultaneously slandering me at every opportunity, both privately and publicly. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law would ridicule me, laughing cruelly at my expense. With such a history, how could I even entertain the idea of helping them now? No matter what you say, my feelings remain unchanged. I cannot help you, I asserted firmly, resolute not to allow their current plight to drag me back into a cycle of manipulation and disrespect. I'm going to hang up now, and please never contact me again. With that, I ended the call and immediately blocked the new number. Knowing my ex-husband's persistence, he might try to change his number and reach out again. But I was determined to maintain my boundaries against any further attempts from him or his family to draw me back into their troubles. Over the weekend, I planned to change my phone number at the store to avoid any further harassment. But before I could do so, my ex-husband and his family broke the agreement established through our lawyers. Unexpectedly, they showed up at my house around 10 p.m., banging on the door and yelling for me to open up and help them. We're family. You should help us. Their loud voices shattered the peaceful night, completely disregarding the late hour and the disturbance they were causing to the neighbors. Rather than confront them directly, I attempted to communicate through the intercom, urging them to go home and stop causing a scene. However, they ignored my pleas and continued to bang on the door, creating quite a commotion. Overwhelmed by their reckless behavior, I was on the verge of calling the police when I heard sirens approaching. A neighbor had already alerted the authorities. Seeing the police, my ex-husband and his companions panicked, mistakenly thinking I had called them. They tried to flee, but with a crowd of onlookers gathering, escape was not an option. The police swiftly intervened, escorting them to the station. I provided a full account of the events, explaining their unwarranted intrusion. The incident quickly became the talk of the neighborhood, and word spread even to my ex-husband's workplace through a coworker who witnessed the scene. Already facing financial difficulties due to a salary cut, this public ordeal and police involvement were the final blows to his professional life. His employer decided to let him go. With no job and unable to afford his apartment rent, tensions escalated within his family, leading to the collapse of their shared living arrangement. My ex-husband, Stephen, along with his mother, now resides in public housing, both working multiple part-time jobs in a desperate effort to make ends meet, with even his mother eager to contribute financially to their reduced circumstances.